The wind moved like an old song across the scrubland, weaving between the brittle fence posts and the tired wildflowers that bowed their heads in dust. It was the kind of wind that carried memory, brittle, bruised, and unwilling to die. Jebediah Cole stood on the porch of a house too quiet for its size. The rocking chair beside him creaked in slow protest, though no one sat in it anymore. It had once held warmth, a woman with sun-soft hair and humming lips, but now it cradled only absence. Inside, the hearth had long since cooled, and though he kept the firewood stacked and dry, it hadn't burned bright in over a year. The townsfolk said Jeb was a man half-turned to stone. They weren't entirely wrong. Grief had carved its name into the soft places of him, places he didn't show to men or mirrors. His hands still worked, plowing soil, patching fences, oiling the old rifle, but his heart, that had folded in on itself the night his wife and unborn son were buried beneath the cottonwood tree. The ranch carried on, because that's what the land demanded. Cows didn't care for mourning. Chickens didn't pause for sorrow. Life insisted, stubborn and indifferent. So Jeb moved through it like a ghost who hadn't figured out how to leave. On this day, this peculiar, wind-heavy day, he dressed slow, as he always did. Wore his faded coat, the one with worn elbows and a frayed collar she had once stitched up with blue thread, and rode into town not for any reason he could name, but because the silence had grown too loud to bear. Dry Creek wasn't much. A saloon, a chapel, a crooked jailhouse, and a main street lined with wooden storefronts that leaned like tired men after a long ride. The general store stood at the center, its windows murky with the dust of late spring. Clara, the storekeeper, stood on the stoop fanning herself with a newspaper, her apron dusted with flour and opinion. "Well, look what the wind's dragged in," she muttered, not unkindly, watching him tie his horse. Jeb nodded. That was all. Words didn't come easy anymore. Inside the store, he bought coffee beans, a tin of peaches, and nails. The essentials. As he paid, Clara watched him the way one watches a man balancing on the edge of something invisible. "You'll want to steer clear of the square today," she said, her voice low. "Ain't nothing but shame and spectacle down there." He looked at her. Just a blink. No questions asked. But Clara, bless her, kept going. "Jacob Ryland's widow, you remember him? Died last winter in that stampede near Red Fork. She's with child now. Her in-laws say she's a burden. Can't feed her, won't house her. So they've decided to auction her off like a cow." Jeb said nothing, but a knot drew tight behind his ribs. Clara sighed, eyes heavy. "They call it charity. I call it what it is. Cruelty with a Bible verse pinned to its coat." He took his things, walked out without a word. Yet his boots turned not toward the path home, but toward the town square, led by something quieter than thought, a pull like gravity or prayer. The square was more crowded than usual. Folks who hadn't been to church in weeks had come for this. A makeshift platform had been hammered together outside the Ryland house, a broad porch painted white and peeling. On it stood a young woman, thin and upright, her hands folded at her stomach. Her dress was plain. Dust clung to the hem. Her face bore no blush, no pride, but something else entirely, a silence made of iron and flame. Elsie Grace Ryland. That name rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. A man with a whiskey-colored beard, her brother-in-law, by the look of him, stood beside her, one hand on her arm like a brand. He cleared his throat and launched into the kind of speech that sounds better from a pulpit than a porch, quoting scripture out of context, justifying shame with ceremony. Jeb stood at the edge of the crowd, unnoticed. He saw her clearly, though. Saw how her jaw clenched just before the man said obedience. Saw the flicker of something almost broken, then mended again by sheer force of will. "She is still of age to be wed," the man was saying. "Still able to bring forth children. We seek a God-fearing husband to take her under his roof. No debts, no demands, just the promise of care. A righteous arrangement." Murmurs rippled. Offers came like flies: 3 pigs, a sack of grain, a rifle. Each offer more disgraceful than the last. A man in a felt hat offered his bootleg whiskey still. Another laughed, promising only a warm place to sleep. Elsie did not flinch. Not once. But her fingers tightened around her belly, and her eyes scanned the crowd as if daring someone, anyone, to look at her and still say she was nothing. Then her gaze stopped, right on Jeb, and for a moment, the world quieted. He hadn't meant to be seen, but now he was. And in her eyes, he saw not fear nor hope, but a single, silent question. Will you let this happen? His chest ached with it, with the gall of men, with the weight of what they called justice, with the memory of a child that never got to breathe, and the wife who died trying to bring it into a world like this. He stepped forward. The wind caught his coat like a curtain being drawn open. Conversations fell away. Laughter died like a fire in the rain. He did not raise his voice. That wasn't his way. I'll take her, he said. No thunder, no fanfare. Just those words, steady as a nail driven true. The brother-in-law laughed nervously. You, Jeb Cole? You ain't said 10 words in as many months. What would you want with? Jeb met his eyes, and something in the weight of that gaze made the man's voice die on his tongue. Elsie stared at him, unblinking. I'll marry her, Jeb said louder now. Not for the land, not for the child, for the principle. A pause, longer than a breath, shorter than eternity. Then Elsie spoke, her voice like soft iron. Then let's be done with it. And just like that, the deal was made. The preacher, fetched from the saloon, stumbled his way through the words. 2 names were spoken. 2 hands touched, rough and trembling. No kiss, no applause, just a binding, quiet as a brand on wet skin. By sundown, they were riding away. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But in the space between them, where silence lived, something unfamiliar began to stir. Not love, not yet, but perhaps something like the first breath after drowning. And as the town behind them returned to its noise and its numbness, the wind carried one last murmur across the land. 2 broken things do not make a whole, but sometimes they make a beginning. The road out of Dry Creek was dust-thick and sun-drenched, winding like a tired thought through the low hills. They rode side by side, Jeb and Elsie, though their horses moved as if strangers, reluctant to follow the same rhythm. The silence between them was not cold, but fragile, like frost on a window pane that had not yet met morning. Elsie kept her gaze forward, her spine straight, her hands light on the reins. Beneath her simple dress, her stomach rose, not yet heavy, but full enough to speak of what was coming. She didn't speak, didn't ask where they were going, didn't thank him. And Jeb, who had never sought to be anyone's savior, didn't offer words he hadn't rehearsed. He just led them home. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped low, a scattering of outbuildings, a windmill turning slow and steady, a house that stood quiet but not unloved. The cottonwood tree near the barn leaned slightly westward, where his wife and son rested beneath the soil. He dismounted and tied his horse. Elsie hesitated before following. When her feet touched the earth, she looked around like someone waking in a place they'd only dreamed of, uncertain if the dream would let them stay. This way, Jeb said, voice low, rough with disuse. He pushed open the door to the house. It gave a soft sigh, like it remembered her kind. Inside was plain, wood walls the color of dusk, a table set for one, a fireless hearth, and shelves lined with neatly kept jars of preserves no one had eaten. The air smelled faintly of cedar and solitude. You can take the room on the left, he said. I'll stay in the loft. She stepped past him, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. Her fingers paused there, tracing the wood grain, before she disappeared down the hall. He heard the door click shut, soft but certain. That first night, neither slept well. The wind changed direction, and the house creaked like it, too, was adjusting to the idea of 2 heartbeats inside its bones. Morning came. The ranch stirred. Jeb found her already up, boiling water, sleeves rolled, hair tied back. She moved with quiet purpose, and though she didn't speak, her presence filled the room like steam from the kettle, slowly, thoroughly. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing, and she didn't seem to mind. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm, not together, not apart, but something in between. Elsie gathered eggs. Jeb repaired a broken rail on the north fence. She baked cornbread. He restocked the feed. Sometimes, they passed each other in the hallway and exchanged nods. Sometimes not even that. But it wasn't coldness. It was a waiting, like 2 candles left unlit in a room not yet ready for light. The town talked, of course. Clara came by with preserves and curiosity. She stayed longer than needed, asking questions with her eyebrows more than her mouth. She's settling in, she said one afternoon, standing in the kitchen with her hands on her hips. She's managing, Jeb replied. Clara murmured, glancing toward the closed bedroom door. Well, there's strength in that girl. The kind that doesn't shout to be noticed. Later, after Clara left, Elsie stood by the window watching the clouds gather low over the hills. Rain would come by dusk. She didn't say it, but Jeb could see it in the way her body leaned slightly forward, as if bracing. That evening, as the first drops tapped gently on the roof, Elsie emerged from her room holding a bundle of linens and the broken remnants of a rocking chair. It was in the corner, she said quietly, her voice the barest thread. Thought I might fix it. Jeb looked at the pieces in her arms, with split, screws missing. It had belonged to his wife, once. She'd rocked herself in it during the final months. He reached out and gently took the parts from her, setting them on the table with care. I'll see to it. Elsie's eyes met his. Not grateful, not pleading, just steady. I can help, she said. He nodded, and that was the first time they worked side by side. Under the low lamp, their hands moved in tandem, hers quick and precise, his slow and sure. They didn't speak, but the air changed, became softer, fuller. The chair was whole by midnight. Afterward, she stood with one hand on the back of it, rocking it just slightly. Her face unreadable. That was hers, wasn't it? She asked. Jeb nodded. I'm not here to replace what you lost, Elsie said. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time. Not as a burden, not as a woman in trouble, but as someone with her own grief. Old, silent, unclaimed. I know, he said. The next morning, something small had shifted. Jeb found fresh bread on the table. A cup of chicory. Elsie was outside, tending to the garden, or what remained of it after last winter's frost. Her hands were dirty, her sleeves damp. He stood in the doorway, watching, not as a man watches a woman, but as a soul recognizes another soul working to stay alive. A week passed, then two. One afternoon, Jeb returned from the far pasture to find Elsie by the barn, crouched beside a boy with sunburned cheeks and a missing shoe. The child looked no older than 8, hair the color of pine bark, eyes wary as a stray dog's. Toby, Elsie said when she saw Jeb. Been sleeping behind the hen house. The boy flinched at the sound of his name. Orphan, she added. Says he came from Dawson Creek. Jeb studied the boy. He saw ribs under his shirt and scars that weren't from falling. We can't keep him, he said slowly. No, Elsie replied. But we can feed him. She led the boy toward the porch. Toby resisted at first, then followed, not looking at Jeb. They ate in silence. Jeb watched the boy steal glances toward the door, calculating escape. But by the end of the meal, his shoulders had lowered. His hands, once shaking, now held a spoon steady. Afterward, Elsie gave the boy a blanket and a place by the stove. She said nothing about keeping him, just left the door unlatched. That night, Jeb stepped outside and looked up at the stars. They blinked slowly in the velvet dark, ancient and unconcerned. But he found himself speaking to them anyway. I didn't ask for this, he whispered. But maybe that doesn't matter. Behind him, the house glowed with low lamplight. A boy asleep on the rug. A woman humming softly as she folded laundry. The chair they'd fixed rocking ever so slightly in the corner. Something in his chest ached, not with pain, but with something older, harder to name. He stayed out a while longer, until the wind changed again, carrying the scent of wild sage and rain-washed wood. It was not comfort, not quite, but it was something like kindness. And inside, unseen, Elsie placed a worn book of Bible verses on her nightstand, not because she believed in them, not yet, but because she wanted to remember what hope might look like if it ever came knocking again. The weeks unfurled like slow-turning pages, each one a little softer, each one bearing the quiet weight of what came before. The ranch didn't change much. The wind still whispered through the long grass. The hens still clucked and pecked. The cows moaned low before sunrise. But inside the house, there was a shift. Small at first, like the sound of water rising behind a dam, not yet breaking, but promising to. Toby stayed, not because anyone asked him to. He just never left. His silence softened into mischief. He carved initials into the porch rail when he thought no one saw. He started feeding the chickens without being told. And one morning, when Elsie coughed too hard lifting a bucket, he appeared beside her with both hands outstretched and said, without looking up, I'll carry it. She smiled then, barely, but Jeb saw it. Saw something ease in her, like a tightly knotted thread beginning to unwind. Their life wove together slowly, without ceremony. Jeb would come in from the fields to find her humming low over a pot of beans. She'd pause to rub her back, and he'd wordlessly take over the stirring. She began wearing his late wife's shawl in the mornings, not as a claim, but as warmth. She left the bedroom door cracked, just a little, just enough. He kept fixing things. Tools, saddles, the small music box she'd tucked away in her drawer, its crank stiff with rust. She hadn't asked him to. She just found it one evening sitting on the table, its lid open, playing a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. She listened all the way through, eyes closed, hands folded over her belly. Still, they hadn't spoken of the marriage. Not really. No talk of love. No questions about the future. It was as if they were walking a path too narrow for words, one step at a time, letting the silence between them breathe instead of burden. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It had texture now. Layers. Like dusk over desert hills. The longer you watched it, the more colors appeared. Then came the letter. It arrived by horseback, sealed in a dusty envelope with the Ryland family's mark burned into the wax. Elsie didn't open it right away. She stared at her name scrawled in ink, thumb brushing over each letter like a wound she'd half forgotten. She placed it on the mantel and left it untouched for a day. Then two. On the third evening, after supper, Jeb found her outside, seated beneath the cottonwood tree, the letter open in her lap. "They want him," she said, not looking up. "The baby. When he's born. They say they'll raise him in the church. That it's their right." The wind tugged at the hem of her skirt. Her eyes were dry, but only barely. "They offered money," she added. "Enough to buy me passage back east. Enough to make it seem like a gift." Jeb didn't answer right away. He sank down beside her, resting his elbows on his knees, looking out at the darkening land. "Do you want to go?" he asked finally. She shook her head. Not a violent no, just a slow, exhausted one. "I want him to have a home. One that doesn't make him feel like he's already a mistake." Jeb turned to her. The setting sun caught the edges of her face, and he saw how thin she'd become, how each breath she took seemed measured, as though too much feeling might tear her in half. "You think I'm just surviving," she whispered. "But I'm not. I'm learning how not to flinch." His chest tightened. There it was, the truth she hadn't said until now. The ache behind her strength. The bruises no one had bandaged. He reached over, not to pull her in, but to place one hand, gentle and steady, over hers. "You're safe here," he said. And she believed him. After that, the pace of things changed. Not faster, just deeper. They sat together more often in the evenings. Toby started reading by firelight, his voice halting but proud. Jeb built a second rocking chair, not a replica, but something new. He placed it beside the first, near the hearth, angled slightly toward it. Elsie said nothing when she saw it, just sat down, closed her eyes, and began to hum. But not everything stayed gentle. Word traveled through Dry Creek like fire through dry grass. Whispers that the Rylands were sending someone. A cousin, a man with papers and persuasion and enough coin to stir trouble. Clara brought the news, her face drawn, her apron wrinkled. "He'll say he wants to talk, that he's acting out of concern. But he's coming to take Jeb." That's all he's ever been taught. That night, Jeb sat by the fire, sharpening a blade he hadn't used in months. Not as a threat, just to feel its weight again. Elsie watched him from the corner, arms crossed over her belly, not speaking. There was nothing to say. The man came 3 days later. He arrived on a sleek horse with polished boots and a silver watch chain winking in the sun. Smiled like he knew your secrets before you opened your mouth. He stepped down, tipped his hat, and asked for Mrs. Ryland. Jeb met him on the porch, shoulders squared, voice flat. "She's Mrs. Cole now." The man's smile widened. "So I heard. They didn't fight. Not physically. But words can be weapons too, and the visitor used his like a scalpel, cutting through pleasantries with veiled insults, slipping scripture between threats, wielding law and reputation like a badge. "She's kin," he said, "and that child is Ryland blood. You can't erase that with a name change and a piece of paper." "I'm not trying to erase anything," Jeb said, "but I won't let you take what's hers." The man left with a promise. Lawyers. Documents. Judges with clean coats and dirted hearts. After he rode off, the silence that followed felt colder than any wind that had ever passed through those hills. Elsie didn't cry. Not then. She went inside, sat in her chair, and looked out the window as if waiting for the future to arrive. Jeb stood behind her, unsure of where to rest his hands, how to offer comfort without crowding. "They won't stop," she said softly. "Not until they've made me small enough to forget." Jeb walked to the fire, took the ledger from the mantel, the one with deeds, receipts, everything he'd ever claimed or lost. He opened it, added a line, and handed it to her. Her name, next to his. Property shared. Rights joined. One house. 2 chairs. She took it in trembling hands. Not for proof, but for something far rarer. The feeling of being chosen when she had nothing left to offer but truth. Outside, the wind picked up again. The sky rumbled low and gray. But inside, the house was still. Not silent. Just waiting. And in that waiting, something new began to take root. Not safety. Not yet peace. But the slow, brave shape of belonging. The storm came in the deep hours of night. Not with violence at first, but with a hush. A hush so complete it felt like the land had paused to catch its breath. Then came the wind, rising from the south like something ancient and angry, bending the trees and pulling smoke down the chimney before tossing it skyward. The rain held back, teasing the dry soil with promise. But the thunder rolled, slow, distant, inevitable, as if it had been traveling toward them for years and only now arrived. Jeb woke to the sound of the barn door creaking. He sat up in the loft, boots already half-laced from habit. Below, the house was still. The boy slept curled near the stove, arms tucked beneath his chin. And in the room down the hall, Elsie stirred. She emerged wrapped in the old shawl, one hand on the small of her back, the other steadying herself on the doorframe. Her belly led her now, full and low, a signal to any who saw her. Time was drawing near. "Go back to sleep," Jeb whispered, moving past her. "It's just the latch." But Elsie shook her head, eyes already wide. "He's coming. I feel it." Jeb paused, then understood. Not the storm, not the lawyer, the child. He turned quickly, his hand on her arm, gentle. "How close?" She winced. Not with fear, with certainty. "Tonight." He nodded once, then took command the way he did with cattle and flood or fire on the ridge. "I'll heat water. Get towels. You lie down. I'll send Toby to Clara's." She gripped his sleeve. "Don't leave me." "I won't," he said, and meant it. The storm raged louder now, wind thundering like hooves across the land. Toby woke as Jeb lit the lantern. The boy blinked, confused, then alert. "Clara's," Jeb said. "Now? Tell her the baby's coming. Ride fast, but careful." Toby was out the door like a shot, barefoot but sure-footed, swallowed by darkness before the rain began to fall. Inside, Jeb stoked the fire higher, boiling water, laying out rags. He'd never delivered a child, but he had watched life enter and leave this world. He had steadied calves born breech, set bones, stitched wounds with shaking hands. He'd done it all with silence and grit. But this was different. Elsie lay in the bed, sweat already beating at her temples. She didn't cry out, didn't curse or scream, just breathed like she was climbing some unseen hill. Each inhale a prayer, each exhale a promise. Jeb stayed beside her, wiping her brow, murmuring soft encouragements he barely recognized as his own. Outside, lightning split the sky. Thunder answered. And with each tremor, a pain passed through her, drawing her closer to the edge. "You're doing good," Jeb said, voice low, rough. "You're almost there." She gritted her teeth. "Don't let them take him." "No one will," he said. "Not while I breathe." And then it happened, sudden and slow all at once. The room stilled. A cry pierced the hush. Not hers. Not his. Theirs. A boy, red and wet and wailing into the world like he already knew what it had taken to get here. Jeb blinked. His hands trembled as he wrapped the child in the cleanest rag he'd set aside. He looked at Elsie, exhausted, slack, radiant, and saw her watching the baby like she'd found the missing verse in a half-remembered hymn. She reached out. Jeb placed the boy in her arms. And there, in the flickering light of the hearth, in a house stitched from grief and grit, a new life rooted itself. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been lived. Toby returned with Clara just before dawn. She burst in flustered, cheeks flushed, muttering curses about boys who didn't knock and horses too slow. Then she saw the baby. Saw Elsie, spent but glowing. Saw Jeb standing nearby, eyes darker and softer than she'd ever seen them. Clara exhaled, shook her head. "Lord help me. I brought a pot of stew." Figured you'd forget to eat. She set it on the stove, then turned to Elsie and smiled. You done it, girl. Stronger than steel, you are. Elsie closed her eyes, the baby tucked against her breast. I'm not alone anymore. The storm passed by morning, left behind puddles, broken branches, and a silence that sounded clean. But trouble hadn't drowned in the rain. 3 days later, the man returned. Ryland's cousin, but this time not alone. He brought a lawyer with a mustache that twitched like it disagreed with everything around him. Papers. Signatures. Authority hidden beneath politeness. We're here for a civil conversation, he said, standing on the porch. No need for fuss. Jeb didn't invite them in. They presented their claims. Spoke of bloodlines and contracts. How Elsie had no legal right to keep the boy, given the family's inheritance. Jeb listened, said little, then handed them the ledger. The lawyer frowned, flipping pages. Marriage? Witnessed. Toby signed, Jeb said. Clara too. So did the preacher out of Lonesome Hill. You'll find his name at the bottom. The men exchanged looks. The law was gray out here, less about books and more about who'd built what and who'd bled where. And Jeb had bled plenty. I suggest you leave, he said quietly. And don't come back. The Ryland man opened his mouth, closed it, then spat in the dirt. We'll be watching. Jeb nodded. Then watch a family grow. They left without another word. That night, Jeb sat on the porch, the baby asleep in a sling across Elsie's chest. Toby dangled his legs off the edge, kicking at fireflies. Clara rocked slowly in one chair, Elsie in the other. 2 chairs. No longer waiting. The house breathed around them, not loudly, but deeply, fully, as if it had waited all these years to hold this moment. You think he'll look like me? Elsie whispered. Jeb glanced at the boy. Maybe, but he'll be his own, just like you. She smiled, the kind that didn't reach her lips, but settled somewhere deeper. The wind moved through the cottonwood. A softer wind this time. Not a warning, a blessing. Inside, the rooms were warm. The scars were still there, but so was laughter, stitched carefully around them. They hadn't fallen in love. They had grown into it, watered by kindness, fed by patience, sheltered by truth. And if thunder ever returned, it would find a house not empty and grieving, but full and blooming, rooted in something stormproof. So if you're watching from wherever you are, a quiet room, a noisy cafe, or a porch like this one, remember, sometimes love isn't loud. Sometimes it just shows up with steady hands, helps carry the bucket, and stays when the sky splits open. If that story moved something in you, share it. Like it. Tell someone else about it. And let us know, friend, where in the wide world are you watching from?